Mamie Garrison arrived in Harlan County, Texas, in the spring of 1882 with nothing but a carpetbag, a letter of employment, and a warning she had not asked for but received all the same. The warning had come from the stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Dub Cooley who smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and who seemed to take a particular interest in setting her expectations low before the wheels had even stopped rolling. "You're heading to the Atkins ranch, are you?" he had said, eyeing her in the small mirror of clouded glass near the front of the coach. "Homer Atkins is the man who runs it. Big spread, good cattle, decent water rights. Man himself, though." He had paused, clucking his tongue. Cold, unfeeling, like talking to a fence post, only the fence post occasionally nods. Mamie had kept her eyes on the window, watching the flat brown expanse of the Texas Hill Country roll past, the scrub oak and cedar standing tough against a wind that never seemed to rest. She had not come to Texas looking for warmth. She had come looking for steady wages and a clean place to sleep, which her previous situation in San Antonio had failed to provide on both counts. "I am not looking for conversation," she had replied crisply, which had made Dub Cooley chuckle and shake his head as if she had said something both foolish and amusing. She was 24 years old. She had buried her mother 2 winters past, watched her father drink himself into a shallow grave the winter before that, and spent the better part of the last 3 years trying to claw together enough respectability to make a life worth living. She had worked as a seamstress, a schoolteacher's assistant, and most recently as a cook and housekeeper for a merchant family in San Antonio who had ultimately moved east without paying her final 3 months of wages. She was not fragile, she was not especially optimistic. But she was capable, and she knew how to work, and when she had seen the advertisement in the San Antonio Express housekeeper and cook needed, Atkins Cattle Ranch, Harlan County, references required, apply in person or by letter, she had written the most composed and professional letter of her life and received a short, almost terse reply indicating she could start the 1st of April. The reply had been signed simply, H. Atkins. Even the signature had felt cold somehow. No pleasantries. No indication of whether the position was permanent or temporary. Just the date and the instructions for how to reach the ranch from the town of Calvary, which was what the nearest town called itself, though Mamie suspected the name was more aspirational than historical. Calvary was a small, sun-bleached collection of buildings straddling a single main street, with a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a saloon that never seemed to close, and a post office the size of a wardrobe. The stagecoach stopped there, and it was there that Dub Cooley had unloaded her carpetbag into the dust and pointed her toward a wagon. The wagon belonged to a ranch hand named Cleet, who was picking up supplies and had apparently been told to collect the new housekeeper on his way back. Cleet was young, maybe 19 or 20, with a sunburned nose and a cheerful disposition that seemed wholly at odds with the landscape around him. He had helped her up onto the wagon bench without being asked, and had spent the 5-mile ride to the ranch talking about nothing in particular, the new colt born last week, the price of feed, whether the rains were going to come early or late this year. "What is Mr. Atkins like?" Mamie had asked partway through the ride, because she figured she might as well hear it from someone who worked for the man rather than from a stagecoach driver who probably just disliked paying road tolls. Cleet had squinted at the horizon for a moment, the way people do when they are trying to figure out how much honesty is socially acceptable. "He's fair," Cleet said finally, "pays on time, doesn't ask you to do anything he wouldn't do himself, works harder than any man on the property. But—" Mamie had pressed because there was clearly a but hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "He doesn't talk much," Cleet said, "doesn't laugh much either. Some of the boys say he used to be different before his wife passed. That was, 5 or 6 years ago now, but I never knew him any other way, so I can't say for certain." Mamie had absorbed this information quietly. A widower. That explained some things, though it did not necessarily make them easier. The ranch itself came into view around a gentle bend in the dirt road, and whatever she had expected, it was not what she saw. It was a proper ranch, large and well-maintained, with a main house built of limestone and timber that sat solid and permanent against the Texas sky. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a small structure she later learned was the root cellar, and a network of split-rail fences enclosing pastures where cattle grazed with the particular air of animals who had no complaints about their situation. It looked like a place that had been built by someone with plans, someone who intended to stay. Cleet helped her down from the wagon in the yard and carried her carpet bag to the front door of the house, where he knocked twice and then stepped back, as if he had delivered a package and was now done with the transaction. The door opened, and Mamie Garrison met Homer Atkins for the first time. He was 32 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who work outdoors in harsh climates often do. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed a trim and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. His eyes were a shade of gray-green that Mamie could only describe as weather-colored, the precise shade of the sky just before a storm decides whether it will be rain or something worse. He wore plain work clothes, canvas trousers, a collarless shirt, boots that had seen considerable use. He looked at her without expression, not rudely exactly, but without any discernible welcome. "Miss Garrison," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Atkins," she replied. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 full seconds but felt considerably longer. "Kitchen needs work," he said. "Previous housekeeper left things in poor order. I'll show you around, then I have to get back to the south pasture." He turned and walked inside, apparently trusting that she would follow. She followed because she needed the wages and because she was not, as she had mentioned, looking for pleasantries. The house was larger inside than it appeared from the road. The front room held a stone fireplace, a settee that had been reupholstered at some point and not very skillfully, and a writing desk covered in papers and ledgers that spoke to the serious business of running cattle in West Texas. The kitchen beyond it was large and functional, with a cast-iron range, a pump over the sink, and a pantry that did indeed need considerable organization. There were 2 bedrooms on the main floor and a loft accessed by a narrow staircase. The housekeeper's room was off the kitchen, small but private, with a window that faced east. Homer showed her all of this with the efficient brevity of a man giving a military briefing. He indicated where things were kept, mentioned that the hands ate in the bunkhouse and she was to prepare their meals and deliver them, and that he ate in the main house at 6 in the morning, noon if he was not in the field, and 7 in the evening without fail. "Any questions?" he asked, pausing at the back door that led to the yard. Mamie had several, but she selected the most practical one. "What do you prefer for your evening meal?" He appeared to consider this as though it were a moderately complex problem. "Whatever is available," he said. "I am not particular." Then he was gone, back through the door, across the yard, and out toward whatever required his attention in the south pasture, leaving Mamie Garrison standing in the kitchen of a house that felt, despite its solid construction, almost entirely empty. She unpacked her carpetbag, organized the pantry, assessed the condition of the range, and began making a list of supplies she would need from Calvary at the first opportunity. She was practical and efficient, and she did not allow herself to think too much about what the stagecoach driver had said, or about the gray-green eyes that had looked at her without warmth, or about the particular quality of silence that seemed to have settled into the walls of the Atkins house like old wood smoke. She simply got to work. The first week established a rhythm of sorts. She rose before dawn, had coffee ready when Homer came in from his morning check of the stock, prepared a meal that was plain but substantial: biscuits, eggs when the hens were cooperative, salt pork or bacon, whatever preserved fruit she could make stretch. She kept the house clean. She delivered meals to the bunkhouse at the appropriate times, where the half-dozen ranch hands received her with varying degrees of shyness and appreciation. She talked to Cleet, who was chatty and easy-natured, and to an older hand named Rupert, who had worked for the Atkins family since before Homer's father died, and who watched Mamie with the careful assessment of someone deciding whether she was going to last. Homer himself she saw mostly at meals, and at meals he said very little. He was not rude. He thanked her for food that was well prepared and made no complaint when something was imperfect. He answered direct questions with direct answers. He offered nothing that was not directly solicited. Cleet had not been wrong, he was fair, he was just not warm. She heard more about him from Rupert during the second week, when she was helping string new clothesline behind the house and the old man had wandered over with nothing particular to do. He used to be different, Rupert said, echoing what Cleet had told her but with more authority. Before Clara passed, he laughed then, told jokes, bad ones mostly. Would stay up late arguing about politics with whoever would argue back. He paused, hands in his pockets, looking at the horizon with the expression of a man reviewing photographs from a long time ago. Clara died in childbirth. The baby, too. That was 1876. He's been like this since. Mamie held a clothespin between her teeth and kept her hands moving along the line. She understood in an abstract way that grief could do that to a person. She had seen it in her own father, though his grief had taken a different, more destructive shape. She did not say this to Rupert. She just nodded, and he walked off, and she finished her line. The second week became the third, and the third became a month, and Mamie began to understand the shape of the ranch the way you understand any place you live long enough. Not all at once, but gradually, in small pieces that eventually form a whole picture. She understood that Homer Atkins was not merely running a cattle operation but building something. He had plans, which she could see in the sketches pinned to the wall of his study, and in the conversations she overheard when he was talking to Rupert, or the other hand's plans for expanding the pastures, for drilling a new well, for investing in better breeding stock. He was not a man without ambition or imagination. He was a man who had simply locked all of that energy into the work, like water that has been redirected from its natural course into a canal. She also understood that the horse barn was his sanctuary. He spent time there that was not strictly required by the demands of ranching. He would go out after supper and stay well past dark, and she had grown accustomed to the lamp burning late in the barn when everything else on the property was dark and quiet. It was on a Tuesday night in the first week of May, about 5 weeks after her arrival, that she woke at some hour past midnight to the sound of something that she could not, at first, identify. She lay still for a moment, listening. The night was warm and she had left her window open, and through it came the usual sounds, the cattle shifting in the near pasture, the wind moving through the cedar, the distant complaint of an owl. But underneath all of that was something else. Something that did not belong to the night's usual vocabulary. She got up, pulled her shawl around her nightgown, and padded through the kitchen and out the back door. The lamp in the barn was burning. That was not unusual. But as she crossed the yard, still half asleep, she heard the sound more clearly, and she stopped walking for a moment just to make sure she was understanding what she was hearing. It was a man's voice, low and broken and barely above a whisper. And mixed into it, the small, labored sounds of an animal in distress. She moved to the barn door and looked inside. Homer Atkins was kneeling in the straw beside the smallest foal she had ever seen. It was a dun-colored creature, born she did not know how recently, and it was clearly struggling, breathing in shallow, effortful bursts, its legs unable to coordinate even the modest act of lying still. Homer had one large hand pressed gently to the foal's side, and his other hand was braced against the straw, and his head was bent low, and she could see, even from the doorway, even in the uncertain light of the single lamp, that his shoulders were shaking. He was weeping. Not loudly, not in any dramatic or self-conscious way, but with the quiet, concentrated grief of a person who believed they were entirely alone and did not know they were being observed. He was talking to the foal in a low murmur, words she could not fully make out, something about holding on and being a good boy and it being all right, and his voice was rough with feeling that she would never have imagined in 5 weeks of knowing him that he possessed. Mamie stood in the doorway for a long moment, completely still, as if she had walked into a cathedral and needed a moment to adjust to the sacred quality of the space. She should have gone back inside. She knew that. She had walked in on something entirely private, something this man would almost certainly not want witnessed, and the respectful thing to do was to retreat quietly and pretend she had never seen it. She did not retreat. She did not know precisely why. Perhaps it was the foal, which was clearly in serious distress and which seemed to her unpracticed eye to need more than one person's attention. Perhaps it was something else entirely, some instinct that operated below the level of polite calculation. She stepped into the barn. Homer heard her immediately. He was that kind of man, attuned to every change in his environment, and his head came up sharply. She watched him gather himself with a speed that was almost painful to observe, the way a person snatches a fallen thing from the ground before anyone can see it. But he could not do anything about the moisture on his face, and he did not fully try, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the lamplit space. She expected him to be angry. She expected him to tell her to go back inside, to apologize for disturbing him, to shut back up the way he always shut back up. Instead, after a long silence, he said, "She came too early. The mare rejected her. I've been trying to get her to take some milk by hand, but she's too weak." His voice was still rough from crying. He did not address the crying. Neither did she. "I know a little about early foals," Mamie said, moving fully into the barn and crouching down on the other side of the foal. "My uncle kept horses in Missouri. Not many, but some. What temperature is she?" "Cold," he said. "Too cold." "Then we need to warm her first before anything else. Do you have rags, dry ones?" He did. He had been thinking along similar lines, she could see, because there were already several rags nearby. They worked together in silence for several minutes, rubbing the foal gently with the rags, generating warmth through friction and pressure, the foal occasionally twitching or making a sound that was not quite a sound, more the suggestion of one. "She's going to need feeding every 2 hours," Mamie said, "if she makes it through the night." "I know," he said. "I've done this before." "Not often. Has she taken any milk at all?" "A little, maybe an hour ago." He paused. "I thought she was settling. Then she started going downhill again." Mamie looked at the foal, then at Homer, then back at the foal. "Then let's try again," she said simply. They tried again. It took patience and persistence and a good deal of careful repositioning, but the foal eventually accepted the offered milk in small, tentative swallows, and after the first few managed swallows, each subsequent one came a little more readily, and after perhaps 20 minutes the rhythm had steadied into something that looked less like survival and more like living. Homer exhaled slowly. It was the most visible expression of feeling she had seen from him at the dinner table. They remained in the barn for another hour, watching the foal, not speaking much but not needing to. At some point, Mamie sat back against a hay bale and pulled her shawl tighter, and at some point Homer sat back against the opposite wall and stretched his long legs out in the straw, and the lamp burned steadily between them. "You should go back to bed," he said eventually. "I can manage from here." "I know you can," she said, and did not move. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not readily categorize. It was not displeasure. It was not quite surprise. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. "What made you come out?" he asked. "I heard a sound," she said honestly. He nodded, looking back at the foal. "I didn't intend for anyone to—" He stopped, started again. "I don't usually—" "Mr. Atkins," Mamie said gently, "you don't have to explain anything to me." Another silence. Longer this time. "Homer," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "My name," he said. He was still looking at the foal, not at her. "It's Homer. If you're going to sit up half the night in my barn, you might as well use my name." Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to or measured. But the quality of the air between them was different from what it had been when she had walked in, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of the first warmth of sun after a long, overcast morning, not because it announces itself, but because its absence had been so constant that its arrival is felt in the blood. "Homer," she said. Then, before the moment could become strange, "Call me Mamie." He looked at her then briefly, and she caught the edge of something in his expression, the ghost of something that might, in another face or another life, have been called a smile. "All right," he said. "Mamie." They stayed until the foal was stable. It was past 3 in the morning when Mamie finally walked back to the house, and she did not sleep again until the sky began to lighten, and when she did sleep, it was with the particular contentment of a person who has done something useful in the night. The foal, a filly, it turned out survived. Homer named her Tuesday, because that was the night of it, and Tuesday became a fixture of the barn and eventually of the pasture. A dun-colored creature with a curious and affectionate temperament that seemed to bear no relationship to the difficulty of her beginning. Mamie visited her regularly, and Homer noticed this without commenting on it, though she sometimes found extra carrots left in the small bucket near Tuesday's stall in a way that was not exactly accidental. Things were different between them after that night. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to a casual observer, but different. Homer began saying things at meals that were not strictly functional. Small observations that the spring had been drier than last year, that the new breeding bull he'd purchased in February had turned out to be better than expected, that Cleet had apparently been trying to teach himself to play the harmonica with results that were, he said with what might have been a slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth, best described as ambitious. Mamie responded in kind. She told him about the kitchen garden she was planning, if he had no objection, and about the letter she'd received from a cousin in Missouri, and about the book she was reading, a novel she'd brought in her carpetbag, one of only 3 possessions she'd considered indispensable. "What book?" he asked, and his interest seemed genuine enough to make her mention the title without apology. It was a novel by George Eliot, which she had been told was not appropriate reading for a woman, and had therefore read 3 times. Homer, to her considerable surprise, said, "Middlemark." She stared at him. "You've read it?" "Clara had a copy," he said, and then the name landed in the air between them like a stone dropped in still water, and there was a ripple, a pause, and then he added more quietly, "She read it aloud in the evenings. I listened." Mamie held very still for a moment, sensing that this was a rare and possibly fragile offering and being careful with it. "It's a remarkable book," she said simply. "It is," he agreed. And then the conversation moved on, as conversations do, but Mamie thought about that exchange for several days afterward, turning it over like a stone she'd found interesting, examining what was underneath it. He had loved his wife. Whatever had happened to him after Clara's death, whatever walls had gone up and whatever brightness had been locked away, the love had been real and the grief had been real. And what the stagecoach driver and the whole town of Calvary had apparently mistaken for coldness was in fact something more like sorrow that had hardened into a protective shape, the way a tree grows around a wound. She did not make the mistake of imagining this made him easy to know, or that a single late-night conversation about literature dissolved 5 years of protective armor. It did not. But it was a beginning of something, and she was patient by nature and experienced by necessity, and she was willing to let things grow at the pace they needed to grow. In the weeks that followed, she found that Homer was a more interesting person than the sum of his silences. He was well-read, which she had not expected, though she reconsidered her expectation as patronizing once she thought about it more carefully. He had a dry, understated sense of humor that only appeared when he had decided a person was safe, and which, once she had learned to recognize it, delighted her enormously because it was never mean-spirited and always very precise. He was deeply fair, in a way that went beyond paying his hands on time. He treated everyone who came to the ranch with the same basic level of human respect, regardless of their station or their race or their history, which was notable enough in 1882 Texas that Mamie took active note of it. One afternoon in late May, she witnessed him in a conversation with a Comanche man who had apparently been coming to the ranch for years to trade. His name was Quanah, not the famous Quanah Parker but a distant relation, and he and Homer had an established and easy relationship that would have made many of the townspeople of Calvary profoundly uncomfortable. Homer traded fairly, offered coffee, and talked with a directness and genuine interest that bore no trace of the condescension Mamie had observed in the way most white Texans spoke about or to Comanche people. She mentioned this to him that evening at supper, carefully. "Quanah's family has been working this land since long before my father came here," Homer said, without any particular defensiveness or pride. "Seems to me that earns a man some respect." "Not everyone would agree with you," Mamie said. "No," he said simply. "They wouldn't." She liked him for that. She had been quietly cataloging the things she liked about him for several weeks by this point, which was not something she had consciously decided to do. It was simply happening, the way inventory accumulates in a storeroom when someone keeps bringing things in quietly, steadily, until one day you notice there is considerably more of it than there used to be. She was not naive about what this meant. She knew, from years of practical experience, that the particular quality of attention she found herself paying to Homer Atkins's hands when he worked, or to the way his voice changed when he talked about something that genuinely interested him, or to the precise shade of his eyes in the morning light, that quality of attention had a name, and it was one that made her considerably wary. She was employed in his house. She had no property, no family nearby, no particular security beyond the wages she earned. The power differential between them was substantial and real, and she was not a woman who ignored reality because reality was inconvenient. She had seen enough of what happened to women who allowed themselves to fall into something complicated with the men who employed them to know that it rarely ended in their favor. She kept this knowledge in front of her like a lantern. It illuminated the path. It did not warm the hands. June arrived with a heat that was serious and total, the kind of heat that makes the air itself seem to shimmer and rearrange itself above the baked earth. Mamie adapted to it with the stoicism of someone who had learned that complaining about weather was one of the least useful things a person could do with their breath. She rose earlier, cooked before the day reached its peak temperature, and rested in the shade of the late afternoon like everything else on the property that had any sense. Homer found her one afternoon sitting in the cedar shade on the east side of the house with the George Eliot novel, and instead of walking past as she might have expected, he sat down in the other chair. There were two cedar chairs there that she had dragged from the porch because the porch was west-facing and therefore murderous in the afternoon, and said nothing for a while, and then said, "Tell me about Missouri." She told him. She told him about the town where she had grown up, which was small and river-scented, and had a particular quality of green in the summer that Texas entirely lacked. She told him about her mother, who had been a teacher before she married and had taught Mamie everything she considered worth knowing. She told him more carefully about her father, who had been charming when sober and intermittently present in that condition, and who had made her childhood a matter of managing uncertainty. She did not tell him everything, but she told him enough that it was honest. Homer listened the way he did most things, attentively, without interrupting, without offering unsolicited wisdom. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You came a long way to take a housekeeping job," he said. "I came a long way to start fresh," she corrected. He nodded, and she thought that was the end of it, but then he said, "My father came from Virginia, came here with nothing but a horse and a determination to build something. I used to think that was brave. Now I think it was just necessary." "Maybe those are the same thing sometimes," Mamie said. He looked at her in that direct way he had when something caught him genuinely off guard, and she held his gaze for perhaps a second longer than she should have. And then she looked back at her book, and he looked at the horizon, and the cedar shade moved gently around them both. That evening at supper he told her a joke, a genuine joke, with a setup and a punchline, something about a rancher and a lawyer and a rattlesnake, which made her laugh out loud, which seemed to please him in a way he was careful not to show too obviously but which was nevertheless visible to someone who had been paying close attention. Things were changing. She knew it. She suspected he knew it too. The question was what either of them was going to do about it. July brought both a heat wave and a problem. The problem arrived in the form of a man named Garrett Polk, who was, by general consensus in Calvary, the kind of person that a frontier town accumulates the way a river accumulates debris, through no particular intention, simply because moving water collects things. Polk owned the saloon, controlled a good portion of the surrounding land through a combination of sharp dealing and legal maneuvering of questionable ethics, and had a long-standing interest in acquiring the water rights that came with the Atkins ranch. Mamie learned about this gradually, from Cleet's easy talking and Rupert's more guarded observations, and from the tension she noticed in Homer's expression on the days when he had been into Calvary for supplies or business. One evening she overheard part of a conversation between Homer and Rupert that was not intended for her. She was in the kitchen and they were in the front room, and Homer had apparently not registered that the kitchen window was open, in which Homer said with a controlled evenness that she had come to recognize as the particular tone that meant he was choosing his words very carefully to avoid expressing the level of feeling underneath them. "Polk is not getting these water rights. Not while I'm breathing." "He'll try through the county," Rupert said. "Let him try. Homer, he's got the county assessor in his pocket." A pause. "Then we get a lawyer. That costs, I know what it costs." The conversation ended there, and Mamie did not raise it at supper because it was not her business, and Homer did not raise it either because he kept his troubles internal by habit. But she thought about it, and about the precariousness of what he had built here, and about what it would mean to have it threatened by a man who saw the ranch as an asset to be acquired rather than a life to be lived. It was Garrett Polk who provided, entirely inadvertently, the occasion for the thing that changed everything. He came to the ranch in the second week of July, unannounced and uninvited, in the company of two other men whose purpose seemed to be decorative in the manner of men hired to convey that their employer had resources. Mamie was in the yard hanging washing when the three of them rode in, and she watched them dismount with the careful assessment she applied to anything unknown that arrived at the front gate. Polk was a large man, well-dressed in the particular way of men who want to be noticed for their prosperity, with heavy gold watch chain and fine boots that had been kept free of the dust of actual labor. He looked at the ranch house with the expression of a man calculating its value, and when he noticed Mamie he looked at her with the expression of a man deciding she was not worth calculating. "Atkins around?" he asked, addressing Mamie the way some men address furniture. "I'll see," she said, and went inside. Homer was at his desk. He heard her come in and looked up. "Garrett Polk is in the yard," she said. Something happened in Homer's face, a brief, controlled tightening that acknowledged what the visit meant before being smoothed away into the neutral expression he wore when dealing with anything that required care. "Thank you," he said, and rose and went out. She did not follow, but she stayed near the front window where she could see the yard, and she watched the conversation, which was not a conversation so much as Polk talking with the particular self-assurance of someone who considers any negotiation already concluded in his favor, and Homer standing with his arms folded and his face expressionless, answering in brief, flat sentences that communicated without any room for misunderstanding that the matter under discussion was not going to go the way Polk wanted it to go. It ended with Polk smiling, the kind of smile that precedes a threat rather than follows an agreement, and Homer not smiling at all, and the three men riding back out the gate with a manner that suggested the conversation was postponed rather than finished. Homer came back inside and stood for a moment in the front room, and Mamie came out of the kitchen with a cup of coffee, which she set on the desk beside him without comment. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "He wants the mineral rights as well as the water," Homer said. "Thinks I don't know what they're worth." "Do you?" Mamie asked because she was genuinely curious. "I have some idea," he said. He picked up the coffee. "He'll push harder before he lets it go." "What will you do? Write to a lawyer in Austin and not lose any sleep over Garrett Polk?" "Is that last part genuine or aspirational?" she asked. He looked at her again with that expression she had come to particularly value, the one that indicated he had been caught off guard by something and was not displeased about it. "Aspirational," he admitted. She smiled, and he watched her smile, and then he looked back at the desk, and she went back to the kitchen, and the afternoon continued around them the way afternoons do, unaware of their own significance. It was 2 days after Polk's visit that Homer asked her, at breakfast, if she would like to ride out with him to see the north pasture, where he was planning the new well. She had not been further from the house than the barn and the kitchen garden since arriving. She said yes before she had fully finished hearing the question. He saddled a gentle mare for her, a gray named Pearl, who had the calm temperament of an experienced schoolteacher. And they rode out in the early morning, before the heat became serious, through pastures where the grass was summer dry and the cattle moved with their heads down and their purpose steady. Homer pointed out landmarks and boundaries, and told her the history of the land in the way that people tell the history of things they care about deeply. Not in organized chronological fashion, but in the associative way of memory. "This rock marks where my father turned the first furrow. This creek is where the fence dispute with the Bellamy Ranch was finally resolved. This tree was struck by lightning the year I was 12. She listened to all of it with real attention, asking questions that were not merely polite, and he answered them at length in a way that he clearly did not always permit himself in conversation, with the expanding, unhurried quality of someone who has rarely been given the chance to say the full thing rather than just the necessary fragment of it. At the north boundary, he showed her where he intended to sink the well and explained his reasoning, the geology and the water table, and the way the land would need to be managed after. And she found that she was genuinely interested in all of it, not because she was performing interest, but because it was his mind at work, and his mind, she had been discovering, was a good one. They ate lunch. She had packed cornbread and dried beef and 2 apples sitting under an old live oak whose shade was deep and good, and it was here, in this particular ease of the midday shade, that she asked him something she had been assembling the courage to ask for several weeks. What was she like? Clara. The question settled between them. He was quiet for a moment that she let stand without trying to fill it. "She was brave," he said finally. "Came out here from Virginia with me when this place was barely a house and a prayer. She didn't complain. She planted things, flowers actually, which seemed impractical, but she said that a person needed beauty to live well." He paused. "She was right about that." Mamie kept her eyes on the middle distance so he could talk without feeling observed. "Do you still think about her often?" "Every day," he said, "though it's different than it was. The first years it was like a wound. Now it's more like a scar, present but not." He stopped. "Not the same kind of pain." "I'm glad," she said quietly, "that it's changed." He looked at her then, and she met his eyes, and there was between them in that moment a current of understanding that required no translation. 2 people who had each carried grief in their own particular way, and who recognized in each other the marks of it, and who were still, despite everything, sitting in the shade on a summer morning in Texas eating apples, which was not nothing. "Your father," he said. It was not a question. He had remembered what she had told him in the cedar shade. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "So am I," she said, "for both of us." They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, side by side, not needing to talk. The cattle were settling. The light was going golden. Tuesday ran along the fence line when she heard Homer's horse, because Tuesday had taken to following Homer the way attached creatures follow the person they have decided to belong to. That night at supper, Homer set a bunch of wildflowers on the table, a rough, untidy collection of Indian paintbrush and black-eyed Susans, and one or two things Mamie couldn't name, clearly gathered in haste, tied with a piece of string. He said nothing about them. He sat down and poured his coffee and began eating as though flowers appearing on the dinner table was a routine and unremarkable event. Mamie looked at the flowers, then at him. He was looking at his plate with the studied concentration of a man who would very much prefer not to be asked about the flowers he had just put on the table. She said nothing. She ate her supper. And inside her chest, something moved with the particular slow certainty of something that has been trying to arrive for a long time and has finally found its way through the door. August was the month when everything accelerated. Garrett Polk's second visit was less civil than his first. He came in the evening this time, alone, and Homer happened to be in the yard with Rupert when Polk rode in, and Mamie was at the kitchen window, and though she could not hear the conversation fully, she could see the body language of it, Polk's aggressive gesturing, the way his horse shifted with the anxiety that horses feel when the air around humans gets sharp with hostility. And Homer standing very still with the controlled stillness of a man who is not afraid and knows it, and intends that to be clearly understood. The conversation ended with Polk pointing at Homer in a way that was unmistakably a threat rather than a gesture, and Homer saying something in a quiet, level tone that made Polk's face change, and then Polk left. Rupert said something to Homer after he'd gone, and Homer shook his head once and came inside. He sat at the kitchen table, which he rarely did. He generally went to his desk after supper, or to the barn, and Mamie poured him coffee without being asked and sat across from him, because it seemed like the appropriate response to the way he looked, which was the look of a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is beginning to feel the cumulative effect of it. "What did he say?" she asked. "He knows about the water agreement my father made with the Bellamy Ranch in 1868, Homer said. He says it's not properly recorded. He's going to use it to contest the water rights. Is there a legal challenge to be made? There might be. I don't know. That's what the Austin lawyer is for." He looked at his coffee. "If he succeeds, this ranch runs dry. Without that water source, I lose the North Pastures. Lose the North Pastures, I can't support the herd I need to make the operation profitable." He paused. "This is my father's land. I'm not losing it to Garrett Polk." The word "my father's" hung in the air with a weight that she understood had multiple layers in it, not just the practical attachment to the land, but the accumulated grief of someone who had built something with another person who was now gone, the need to vindicate that labor, the specific determination of a son who has lost his father and carries forward what was left behind. "Then you won't," she said. He looked up at her. "You're thorough and you're careful and you know this land better than any lawyer or assessor," she continued. "Find the original agreement. If your father made it, there will be record of it somewhere. Letters, ledgers, something." He was quiet for a moment. "Then my father kept everything. His papers are in trunks in the loft." "Then that's where we start," she said. He stared at her. She held his gaze steadily. "I have a good head for paperwork and I have nothing else pressing tomorrow evening, unless you'd rather do it alone." The pause that followed was shorter than usual. "No," he said, "I wouldn't rather do it alone." They spent 3 evenings going through the trunks in the loft, the old papers and letters and ledgers of a man who had built a ranch from raw land and kept meticulous record of every transaction and decision. It was close work in the warm air of the loft, kneeling over open trunks with lamps near, and it was surprisingly intimate, not physically, but in the way that handling another family's history always is, the quiet archaeology of someone else's life. Mamie found the agreement on the 3rd evening, tucked inside a Bible that had been wrapped in oilskin cloth and placed at the bottom of the 2nd trunk as though it were understood to be important. It was a formal written agreement, signed by both Homer's father and the elder Bellamy, dated 1868, witnessed and notarized by a man whose signature was clear, and whose name they were able to confirm the following week was a county clerk who had since retired to San Marcos and was very much alive, and would be willing to attest to the document's validity. Homer held the paper for a long moment, looking at it with an expression she could not fully see because the lamp was behind him. Then he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he had it in the Bible. He knew it mattered, Mamie said. Yes, Homer said, he knew that. She watched him fold the paper with careful deliberation and place it in the inside pocket of his vest, close to his chest, and she thought about fathers and about the long work of carrying things forward, and about how love does not always look like tenderness. Sometimes it looks like a document in a Bible, saved against future need. The Austin lawyer confirmed the agreement's validity in September. Garrett Polk was informed through official channels that his challenge had no legal foundation. The matter ended without drama, as legal matters sometimes do when the evidence is clear, and Polk retreated to his saloon and his scheming with the air of a man storing up a grudge for future use, which was probably true, but which was also a future problem and not a present one. Homer came home from Calvary the day the legal notice arrived, looking lighter than she had seen him, not visibly different in any way that someone who didn't know him well would have caught. But she knew him well by now, and she saw it. At supper he said, "It's resolved. The water rights are secure." "I'm glad," she said. He nodded. Then, after a moment, "It would not have been resolved the same way without what you found." She started to say something modest, that it was simply practical, that anyone would have done the same, but he stopped her with a look. Not a sharp look, not a commanding one. Just a direct, honest look that said he wanted what he was saying to be received as what it was, which was genuine gratitude and something more that it shared its face with. "Thank you, Mamie," he said. She let herself receive it. "You're welcome, Homer," she said. They held that for a moment, just their names in each other's mouths, in the warm, familiar space of the kitchen at supper, and then they went back to eating, and the evening continued, and the fire in the range made its steady sounds, and outside, Tuesday whinnied once in the barn as if she had something to add. September cooled into October. Mamie had been at the ranch 6 months. She was still sleeping in the housekeeper's room off the kitchen, still preparing meals, still managing the household. These facts had not changed. Everything else had. She knew what she felt. She had known it since the night under the live oak tree, or possibly since the night of the Foal, or possibly since the very first time he'd said her name in the barn, and his voice had still been rough from crying, and she had heard in it the sound of a person who had been alone with their feelings for a very long time. She also knew the vulnerability of her position. This was not a feeling she could afford to be wrong about. This was not a situation where the cost of a mistake was embarrassment. The cost was her livelihood, her lodging, potentially her reputation in the only county she was able to call home at the moment. She had no cushion. She had no other option waiting in reserve. And Homer was a private person who had not, in 6 months, made any direct statement about his feelings that she could not plausibly attribute to employer decency. The flowers. She thought about the flowers regularly. They had continued, actually, not every week, but often enough to be a pattern rather than a coincidence. Sometimes on the dinner table, once on the porch near her chair. Once, most startlingly, inside the kitchen door where she would see them first thing in the morning, wrapped in the same rough string, a little more artfully assembled each time, as though someone was applying incremental effort to the project of becoming better at something. She thought about the way he listened when she spoke, with his full attention, in a way that was not performative courtesy but genuine interest. She thought about Tuesday, and how he had named the filly after the night they had kept her alive together, and how every time she saw that small dun horse in the pasture she thought about a man weeping in a barn at midnight, and then handing her the most honest and unguarded version of himself she had ever seen from anyone. She thought about his hands. She thought about his voice. She thought about the way he stood when he was outside and thinking, still, not restless, just present in himself, as if he was not troubled by his own company. She was deeply in love with him. This was not a conclusion she had arrived at suddenly or welcomed without reservation. It was simply the truth, and she was a woman who had learned that ignoring the truth because it was inconvenient had consequences. The question remained what to do with it. It was the question she was turning over one October morning when she was in the kitchen garden, which had become her genuine pride by now, a well-ordered plot of fall vegetables and herbs that was producing more than she had originally projected, and she heard him behind her and turned. He was standing at the garden gate with his hat in his hand, which she had come to understand as a physical signal that he was about to say something that mattered to him and was not sure how it would land. "I need to go to Calvary tomorrow," he said, "for supplies and some business. I'd like you to come with me if you're willing." This was not an unusual request on its face. She sometimes came to Calvary for domestic supplies, and they had ridden in together twice before on practical errands. But something in the way he said it was different from those occasions, something in the careful deliberation of the phrasing. "I'm willing," she said. They drove in the next morning in the buckboard, leaving after chores and reaching Calvary before 10. Homer did his business, the lawyer's office, then the general store, and Mamie did hers, and they met again at the buckboard around noon. He had bought coffee from the shop near the post office, 2 cups, and he handed her one without ceremony. They stood together in the shade of the store's awning, drinking coffee and watching the modest traffic of a small Texas town going about its October business. "Mamie," he said. The way he said her name had changed over the months. She could chart it if she tried. In the beginning it had been simple identification, the name as a label. Then it had become comfortable, habitual, the name as a form of ease. Now when he said it, there was something in it that was not any of those things, something that was a question and a declaration at the same time, wrapped in the 4 syllables of her name. She waited. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that from the start. I'm not good at it, and it has been a long time since I tried." "I know," she said. "I'm not the same man I was before." He stopped. "Tried again." "What I feel," another stop. She watched him with the patience of someone who has time and intention to spare. He set down his coffee cup on the boardwalk railing and turned to face her directly. The way he faced things he was determined to handle with honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. "I think you are the best person I have ever had the privilege of knowing," he said. "You are steady and you are honest and you are kinder than you let people see. And I think about you when I'm not with you. And I have been trying for several months to determine whether saying that to you would be a mistake. And I've decided that not saying it would be a worse one." Mamie looked at him for a long moment, this tall, weather-worn, gray-green-eyed man with his hat in his hand, and his whole careful heart on display, in a way that she knew cost him considerably. Standing in the October light in a small Texas town, looking at her with an expression that she had seen glimpses of for months, but was seeing now in full, undisguised. And she felt something in her chest that was equal parts joy and relief, and the specific sweetness of a thing you have waited for and thought might not come and has come at last. "Homer," she said, "it would not be a mistake." The lines around his eyes shifted. That near smile, that real one, the one she had only seen in small increments before, it arrived in full now, and it rearranged his whole face, and it was, she thought, the most beautiful thing she had seen in a very long time. "Good," he said, in a voice that was not quite steady. She reached out and took his hand because it was right there, and because she had wanted to for months, and because sometimes the most direct action is the correct one. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and it closed around hers with a careful certainty that felt like a promise. They drove home in the afternoon, not needing to talk very much, the buckboard rolling through the October landscape that was beginning to take on its own kind of beauty. The cedar going dark green against the tawny grass, the sky that particular high blue that belongs specifically to Texas in fall, and they held hands on the bench when the road was smooth enough to make it possible. And when Mamie looked at the side of Homer's face, she could see that the thing she had noticed about him in the early weeks. That quality of emptiness, of absence, was not fully present anymore. He was not cured of his grief, because grief is not a disease that admits cure. but he was present in a way he had not been, and she knew, because she had been watching him carefully for 6 months, that this was not a small thing. That evening after supper he walked her around the house to the east side, where the first of Clara's flowers, a rosebush that had been maintained by habit and was putting out its last late-season blooms, was lit by the remaining sun, and he said, "She planted this." Mamie looked at the rose, then at Homer. "I want you to know that it doesn't trouble me," she said carefully, "that she was here, that she was real, and that you loved her. I don't need you to choose or to leave anything behind." He looked at her for a long moment. "She would have liked you," he said. "I think about that sometimes. She would have had 10,000 opinions about the kitchen garden." Mamie felt her eyes sting with something that surprised her. "I would have liked her too," she said, and meant it. He squeezed her hand. She leaned into his shoulder briefly, and he turned slightly so that he could put his arm around her, and they stood in the last of the October sun beside Clara's rosebush. And it was somehow right, somehow inclusive and honest rather than complicated, because love that is large enough does not require the past to be erased in order for the present to be good. The courtship, which was what it was, openly and without pretense, proceeded through October and November with the particular combination of new excitement and deep ease that comes from two people who have been living alongside each other long enough to know each other before they began falling in love. There was no performance involved, no anxiety about first impressions, because the first impressions had long since been revised and deepened into something more accurate and more substantial. Homer was attentive in the specific, unshowy way of someone who notices things rather than making gestures. He noticed when Mamie's coffee was empty and refilled it without being asked. He noticed when she was tired and said so, and told her to rest, and meant it without resentment. He noticed what she was reading and thought about it enough to have an opinion worth sharing when she was ready to discuss it. She cooked for him with particular care and intention now, not because she felt obliged to impress him, but because feeding someone you love is a specific and satisfying pleasure, and she had discovered she was very good at it. He told her so, plainly and genuinely, which she received with more pleasure than she would have admitted to anyone. Rupert noticed. He said nothing to Mamie directly, but she caught him watching the two of them one morning with the expression of someone whose long-held hope has finally been given reason to be, and she suspected he was quietly pleased in the way that people are pleased when the people they care about are no longer alone. Cleet noticed and was considerably less subtle about it, managing to make a series of comments that were ostensibly about ranch business but were clearly doing something else entirely, until Homer fixed him with a look that caused Cleet to find urgent business elsewhere, after which Homer stood for a moment looking at the space where Cleet had been, and then said with great seriousness, "He means well." "I know," Mamie said, laughing. "He's going to be insufferable," Homer said, and there was the full smile again, the one that she was collecting like pressed flowers. In November, on a cool and clear Saturday, Homer brought Tuesday out of the pasture and into the yard where Mamie was working, and Tuesday trotted up to Mamie with the familiarity of an old friend and pushed her nose against Mamie's shoulder in the affectionate, demanding way of horses who have decided they like a person. "She chose you," Homer said, watching this with an expression of open satisfaction. "Horses are very wise," Mamie said, stroking Tuesday's neck. "Smarter than most people I know," Homer agreed. Then he added, without looking away from Tuesday, "I told her about you, back in the spring, after that night. I was out here in the evenings and I didn't have anyone to talk to, so." He paused. "I told her that you were remarkable. I told her I hadn't expected it." Mamie stopped stroking Tuesday and looked at him. "You talked to a foal about me," she said. "She was a good listener," he said, and there was something in his voice that was entirely stripped of irony. He meant it, and he knew how it sounded, and he did not care, and the fact that he did not care was somehow the most touching part of it. She crossed the space between them and kissed him, which was the first time, because the moment was right, and because she had been waiting for it, and because sometimes you simply do the thing that needs to be done. He was very still for a moment, with the stillness of someone receiving something they had not let themselves expect. And then he was not still at all, and his hands came up to either side of her face with a gentleness that was almost painful in its care, and he kissed her back with the full presence of a man who has decided to stop holding anything back. Tuesday made a sound of hoarse disapproval at being ignored and pushed her nose against Homer's arm, which broke the moment into laughter, and the laughter was good, the best kind, unguarded and genuine, and the sound of two people who were happy in the specific way that means more than simply the absence of sadness. December came with a cold that was serious by Texas standards, and the ranch went into its winter rhythm. The cattle moved to the closer pastures, the work contracting into shorter days and longer evenings by the fire. Homer proposed to Mamie on a December evening, formally and without artifice, kneeling in the front room of the house with a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small seed pearl, which he had apparently been carrying for 3 weeks while he worked up the exact configuration of words he wanted to use. The words, when they finally came, were these: "I want to spend my life with you. I want to build something with you. I want you beside me in the morning and across the table at supper and in the barn at midnight when things go wrong, because things will go wrong, and I know now that I don't face things as well alone as I do with you. I love you, Mamie. I have loved you for a long time, and I intend to keep on doing it." She said yes before he had fully finished the sentence. He placed the ring on her finger, and she pulled him up from his knee because she preferred him at his full height. And the fire in the fireplace did the thing fires do in such moments, burned steady and bright and warm, providing the scene with all the atmosphere it needed. They were married in March, as the second spring of Mamie's time at the ranch began to assert itself against the last of winter. The ceremony was held in the Calvary Church, which smelled of cedar and old hymnal books, and was attended by Rupert and Cleet and the other hands, and by a handful of Calvary townspeople who had formed opinions about Mamie in the preceding months that were universally positive, and by a woman named Martha Chen, who ran the general store with her husband Way, and who had become, in the course of Mamie's regular supply trips, something close to a genuine friend. It was a plain ceremony, as they had both wanted. The minister was a practical man who respected their mutual desire for substance over decoration. Homer wore his best suit, which Mamie had spent 2 evenings carefully pressing, and Mamie wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself in the late winter evenings by lamplight. And when Homer saw her walk toward him in the church, he had the expression of a man who has been given more than he expected and knows it and is glad. He held her hands during the vows with the particular grip of someone who is keeping hold of something precious, and when they were pronounced married, he kissed her with a tenderness that made Martha Chen weep quietly into her handkerchief, and made Cleet look at the ceiling with the red-faced determination of a young man committed to not being seen having feelings. Rupert said afterward quietly, to no one in particular, that he was glad. Just that. Just, "I am glad," and it was enough. The spring and summer of 1883 were, by any measure that Mamie could apply, the best months of her life to date. Not because they were without difficulty. They were not. The well was drilled, which was expensive and time-consuming and required 3 weeks of disruption to the North Pasture operations. 2 of the hands moved on, and replacements had to be found and trained. Garrett Polk filed a new challenge, this one regarding the fence line on the eastern boundary, which turned out to have no merit but required legal attention nonetheless, and cost 2 trips to Austin and a good deal of correspondence. But these were the difficulties of a life being actively built, and they were faced together, and that made all the difference. Homer consulted her on matters he would previously have held entirely internal, and she found that she was useful, not merely domestically but strategically, with a clear head and a practical intelligence that he valued genuinely, told her so, and acted on. She was not just managing the household now. She was managing the books, which had been in Homer's charge and which she had reorganized into a legibility that pleased him enormously, and she was corresponding with suppliers and handling the domestic accounts and gradually taking on more of the administrative work that had been scattered across Homer's desk in the formidable accumulation of a man trying to run both a cattle operation and a household alone. The garden expanded. She added a second kitchen garden on the south side of the house, with rows of tomatoes and squash and peppers, and she kept chickens now, a flock of 10 that Cleet had helped her build a proper coop for, and which she had named with the specific affection of someone who takes genuine pleasure in small, living, ridiculous things. Homer observed her naming the chickens one afternoon with the expression of a man trying very hard to keep his face neutral. "The brown one is Margaret," Mamie told him. "Is it?" he said. "And the small spotted one is Edith. The other spotted one is also Edith because I forgot I'd already used the name." There was a pause. "You have 2 chickens named Edith." "They don't seem to mind," she said. He laughed then fully, openly, the way he laughed now when they were alone, the way she had been accumulating since November like something she was making a collection of. It was a good laugh, low and warm and real, and it turned his whole face into something she could look at for the rest of her life without getting tired of it. In September of 1883, Mamie told Homer she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, at breakfast, because there was never a perfect time for significant information, and because the morning light was good and she wanted to see his face clearly. He was still for a moment. Very still, the kind of stillness that precedes feeling rather than containing it. Then his eyes, which she knew every variation of by now, changed in a way she had not seen before. Something opened in them, some deep thing that had been kept very carefully and safely behind everything else. And it was joy, undisguised and total, but it was also grief and hope braided together with the particular complexity of a man who had wanted this once before and lost it, and was being offered it again. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair the way he had knelt when he proposed, and he took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long time without speaking. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "Are you?" "I am well," she said firmly. "I am more than well." He pressed his forehead to hers, and she felt him exhale with the length and completeness of someone setting down a weight they had carried for a very long time. "All right," he said softly. "All right." Rupert cried when they told him, which surprised everyone including Rupert, who covered it quickly with a cough and a claim of dust. Cleet, to his credit, managed his feelings with considerably more composure than usual, shaking Homer's hand, with a seriousness that suggested he had rehearsed the moment, and then telling Mamie that the new baby was going to be the luckiest person in Harlan County, which was said with such unaffected sincerity that she hugged him. And Cleet turned the color of the Indian paintbrush in the spring pasture and was speechless for approximately 20 minutes. The pregnancy proceeded well. Mamie was constitutionally practical about it, continuing her work at a sensible pace, adjusting as adjustment was required, and refusing to be treated as an invalid, which was a point of occasional discussion between her and Homer, who tended toward a protective solicitude that was entirely sincere and occasionally overlapping with the border of what Mamie considered reasonable. "I am carrying a child, not made of blown glass," she told him in November, when he had suggested for the 3rd time that perhaps she should not carry the heavy preserving jars herself. "I am aware of that," he said. "I am also aware that I have very few ways to be useful in this particular situation, and carrying preserving jars is one of them." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had learned to say the precise and honest thing rather than the defensive or deflecting one, and she set down the jar she was carrying and let him carry it, because the honest truth underneath the argument was that she loved being cared for by him, and she was allowed to admit it. The child was born in April of 1884, in the same spring warmth that had attended Mamie's arrival 2 years before, which seemed like a kind of symmetry. The birth was attended by a midwife from Calvary named Mrs. Ortega, who was competent and calm and had delivered, by her own account, more than 300 babies in the surrounding country and had never lost a mother to childbirth, which was the statistic she led with, and which she clearly considered both her professional pride and her primary service to the anxious husbands she regularly encountered. Homer was in the front room during the birth, which was how it was done, and Rupert stayed with him because Mamie had asked Rupert to, knowing that Homer would not ask for company but would benefit from having it. The labor was long but not complicated, and when Mrs. Ortega came to the door of the front room and said that he had a healthy son and his wife was well, Homer said nothing for a moment, and then said thank you with a voice that required careful management to keep steady. The boy was named Thomas, after Homer's father. Thomas William Atkins, born April 1884, in the limestone and timber house that his grandfather had built in the Texas Hill Country, in a room where the window faced east and the morning light came in clean and good. Homer held his son for the first time with the careful, almost reverent attention of a man handling something of irreplaceable value, and he looked at the small, new, astonishing face of this person who was both his and Mamie's and brand new to the world. And Mamie, watching from the bed where she was still tired from the labor but entirely present, saw in Homer's face the full resolution of something that had been fractured for a very long time. He wept then, quietly and without embarrassment, the same way she had seen him weep in the barn over Tuesday, the weeping of a man who feels things all the way down and does not always know what to do with the depth of it except to let it be. She reached out and took his hand. He took it back, their son between them, the April morning full of light. The years that followed were good ones, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary griefs and challenges of a life being lived in a particular place and time, but good in the deep, substantive way that means they had weight and meaning and were shared. Thomas grew into a boy of considerable personality, which Mamie privately suspected was inevitable given his parentage. He had Homer's gray-green eyes and Mamie's relentless curiosity, and from the age of 3, he was following Homer around the ranch with an intensity of interest that Homer met with an equally intense patience, explaining things in full, honest detail to a child who understood more than most adults gave children credit for. Tuesday, now a mature and opinionated mare who had been given free run of the near pasture since she was a yearling, took an immediate and proprietary interest in Thomas, following him along fence lines and making sounds of hoarse disapproval when he moved outside her line of sight. Mamie found this both hilarious and deeply affecting. This horse whose life she and Homer had kept together in a barn at midnight, now guarding the son they had made together, as if she understood something about the through line of it. Rupert retired from active work in 1886, at a point when his back was giving him the kind of serious trouble that required rest rather than more ranch work, and Homer and Mamie invited him to stay on the property rather than moving to Calvary, which was what he had vaguely planned. He stayed in the bunkhouse, did lighter tasks, and became, effectively, the only grandfather Thomas had access to, a role he filled with more enthusiasm than he had perhaps expected to feel, and more love than he showed in any way other than the accumulation of small, consistent acts that were its truest evidence. Cleet took over as head hand, which he was by then fully ready for, and hired on 2 new men, and continued to be easy and cheerful and straightforwardly kind, and eventually, in 1887, brought home a wife of his own, a schoolteacher from Calvary named Ruth who had a laugh like water and a directness that Homer immediately respected. Mamie loved her within a week. The second child, born in 1887, was a girl. They named her Clara Josephine, after both the women who had shaped Homer's life, and the naming was Mamie's suggestion, and Homer received it with the specific quality of gratitude that is too deep and too complex for ordinary words, and so he said nothing and pulled her close and held her for a long time, which said everything. Clara Josephine arrived into a house that was ready for her, a house that smelled of bread and cedar, and the particular clean earth scent of the kitchen garden, a house where the front room had gained a shelf of books and a proper settee and new curtains that Mamie had made, and where the desk was still piled with ledgers, but they were well-organized ledgers now, and where the stone fireplace burned every evening through the winter months with the specific warmth of a place that is not merely inhabited but loved. The rosebush on the east side of the house bloomed every spring. Mamie tended it with care, and Homer watched her tend it with a look on his face that she had long since learned to read and never got tired of seeing. The legal challenge from Garrett Polk did not recur. Polk sold the saloon in 1885 and moved east, and Calvary gradually stopped associating his name with anything other than the memory of how he had been. The Atkins ranch continued to grow and improve, the new wells serving the north pastures as Homer had planned, the herd expanding, the operation becoming one of the more respected in the county. Homer was asked to serve on the county land board in 1886, which he did with the same fairness and direct honesty that characterized everything else he did. Mamie continued to manage the books and the domestic operation, and increasingly, to be regarded by the surrounding community as someone whose opinion was worth having. She corresponded with the county school board in 1888 about the inadequacy of the Calvary schoolhouse and the need for a permanent teacher who would not also be expected to double as the church organist, a combination of duties that she argued was not fair to either function. The school board, composed of men who had learned that Mamie Atkins's correspondence was not to be dismissed without serious consideration of the consequences, took her point. A new teacher was hired. A new schoolroom was added to the church building. Thomas started school that fall, at age 4.5, walking into the schoolhouse with the confidence of someone who has been read to every evening of his life and considers books old friends. His teacher, a young woman from Austin named Miss Adler, sent home a note in the second week saying that Thomas was already reading at a level above most children twice his age, and asking if this was a general pattern or something particular to him. Mamie wrote back a note that said, with understated honesty, particular to him, I believe, but also general to his household. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Homer and Mamie sat together in the front room the way they had been sitting together since she had first dragged 2 chairs into the east side cedar shade. They read, or talked, or sat in the comfortable silence of people who have no need to fill the quiet between them, because the quiet is not empty, but full of the accumulated weight of a life shared. Sometimes he read aloud, which he was good at, with the unhurried cadence of someone who had learned the pleasure of it from someone he loved. Sometimes she told him something that had made her think during the day, and he listened with his full, genuine attention. On a warm May evening in 1889, 7 years after Mamie Garrison had arrived in a stagecoach with a carpet bag and a warning she hadn't asked for, she sat on the porch with Homer in the last of the daylight and watched their son run through the pasture with Tuesday lumbering after him and their daughter sleeping in her arms, and she thought about the sum of it, not abstractly but concretely. The way you add up numbers and arrive at a total that is larger and more surprising than any individual figure suggested. The stagecoach driver had been wrong. That was the most straightforward way to say it. He had been wrong about Homer, and she suspected that even the people who had agreed with him, the townspeople who had called him cold, who had built a reputation for him out of his silence and his grief, had been wrong in the way that people are wrong when they mistake the visible surface of a person for the whole of them. Homer was not cold. He was private. He was cautious. He had been protecting something that had been badly hurt, the way an animal cradles a wound, and people who had not known him before and did not have the patience or the proximity to look more closely had seen the protection and called it the absence of feeling. But he wept over dying foals at midnight. He talked to horses about the person he loved. He named a filly after the night that changed things. He kept his father's papers in trunks in a loft and found, in the middle of the night and the middle of grief, a man who had the presence of mind to place the most important document in the safest place he knew. He planted no flowers himself but maintained the ones that were already there, and noticed when the person he loved began to plant her own, and watched with an attention that was itself a kind of love. Homer felt everything. He had always felt everything. He had simply learned in the hard school of loss to feel it quietly. She shifted Clara Josephine in her arms and looked at her husband's profile against the last of the sky, and he turned his head and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been looking into for 7 years and that she still found, on evenings like this, as interesting and alive as they had been the first time she had understood what she was looking at. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That the stagecoach driver was wrong," she said. He considered this for a moment. Dub coolly. "You know what he said." "Calvary is a small town," Homer said mildly. "He told me you were cold and unfeeling," Mamie said. Homer looked back at the pasture where Thomas had somehow persuaded Tuesday to stand still while he attempted to lean against her flank, which Tuesday was tolerating with the martyred patience of a creature that has long since given up maintaining dignity. "Is that still your assessment?" he asked. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, careful of the sleeping baby, and pressed his lips to her hair. Outside, Thomas was laughing, and Tuesday made a sound of hoarse approval, and the spring evening was warm and full of the smell of cedar, and the kitchen garden and the particular sweet staleness of ranch air at the end of a good working day. "Not even slightly," she said. He held her tighter. The fire would need to be built up before the evening was done. Thomas would need to be called in from the pasture and persuaded that bedtime was not an injustice of catastrophic proportion. Clara Josephine would wake in 2 hours and need feeding. The books needed entering. There was correspondence on the desk. Rupert's back had been troubling him again, and she meant to ask Mrs. Ortega about it the next time they were in Calvary. The list of things that constituted a life was long and ongoing, and it turned out not a burden but a gift, the specific, concrete gift of having enough to tend and enough to love and enough time to do it in. The night settled over the Atkins ranch the way nights settle over a place that has earned its peace gradually, completely, with the particular quality of darkness that is not absence but rest. Somewhere in the barn, a lamp would not need to burn tonight in solitary grief. The foals in the near pasture were healthy, and the grass was good, and the water from the north well was clear, and the fences held and the books were balanced, and the house was full. Thomas came running from the pasture as the last light went, dusty and bright-eyed and completely unwilling to acknowledge the concept of bedtime, and Homer stood up from his chair to receive him, catching the boy mid-run and swinging him up with the easy strength of a man accustomed to physical work. And Thomas's laughter hit the evening air like something let loose, and Mamie stood with her daughter and watched the two of them and felt, in the marrow of her bones, the specific and irreplaceable weight of a life that had become entirely, exactly what she had not known she was coming to Texas to find. She had come looking for wages and a clean place to sleep. She had found all of it. The wages, the clean place, and the man behind the silence. The man who felt things too deeply for casual company, who had loved and lost and learned to love again, who wept over small dying creatures in the dark and named them after the nights that changed things. She had found Homer Atkins, who was not cold, who had never been cold, who was, as she had told him on a porch in May with the stars coming out and the cedar on the breeze and their children between them, the best and most surprising thing that Texas had to offer, which, she had to admit, was saying something considerable. He looked at her over Thomas's shoulder, this man she had married, this man she had chosen and who had chosen her, and he smiled, the full smile, the one she had been collecting since the beginning, the one that had once been rare as winter rain and was now as regular and reliable as the morning, and she smiled back, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.